working with giants like Jim Rohn, Zig Ziglar, and John Maxwell, how did you get to work with them?
Now, most speakers, when they meet those guys, they say, I want to be just like you. Can you help me? Wrong question. Guys at that level don't have a lot of time to help you. Most people don't understand how influence works. What is it that really triggers in the other person's mind? I want to follow this person. I want to know more from this person. I want to learn more. I want to do more. I want to work with this person. And influence is something that we use in all areas of our life. Some people say, you're too old, you're too young, you're too fat, you're too skinny, you're too tall, you're too short, you're too white, you're too black, you're too Asian, you're too this, you're too that, None of the outside matters. What's up here and what's in here, that's what matters. Zig used to say money isn't everything, but it's right up there with oxygen. Half the country hates the other half of the country, and we've lost our way. Spiritually, we've lost our way. And I believe that there needs to be a revival of faith. There needs to be people reconnecting with what the real purpose of life is all about. The best piece of advice I was ever given.
Hi everyone, I'm Maria Mollen and you're listening to the Now You Know podcast. My guest today is someone whose name is synonymous with leadership, influence and personal transformation. His voice and work have impacted millions. He's been named one of Inc. magazine's top 100 leadership speakers and is a member of the Motivational Speakers Hall of Fame. Chris Widener is a best-selling author of over 25 books, the co-author of the best-selling book 12 Pillars with Jim Rohn, and a globally renowned speaker and advisor to some of the biggest names in leadership and personal development. He's been mentored and worked with legends like Jim Rohn, Zig Ziglar, and John Maxwell. But before we get into the conversation, I want to share a little story with Chris. Back in 2004, I attended a Jim Rohn leadership event in Anaheim, California. Brian Tracy was one of the speakers, along with several others. And I had the chance to meet Jim Rohn. It was a moment I'll never forget. And that weekend taught me lessons that truly changed my life. Now, these are people I admire, I learned so much from. But there was someone else at the event I didn't know at the time, and an incredibly energetic, charismatic speaker who was actually hosting the event. I remember my husband and I turning to each other and saying, who's this guy? I mean, he's good, who is he? And that speaker, it was Chris Widener. We had no idea who he was back then, but I never forgot the impression he made. And today, it feels like a full circle. To have him here on the show, I mean, it's an honor. Chris, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to have you here.
I've never started tearing up during my introduction before.
Oh,
That was a great weekend. It was July 31st and August 1st and 2nd, or July 30th, 31st and the 1st, something like that. It was Jim Rohn. It was Brian Tracy. Dennis Waitley was there. And then there was Charlie Tremendous Jones, he's an amazing personality who was a contemporary of Jim and Zig and Brian, but he's not nearly as famous as them, but he was really, really good. And of course we had Jerry Clark was there and just a whole bunch of great people. And it was about 1,300 people. And I really believe we did an audio and video series afterwards. And I think that is the best personal development program ever created. It was so good. That weekend was so good. And I had the opportunity to MC that event is what I did. I was the MC and they let me speak a couple times, but that was a great event. I didn't know you were there. That's fantastic.
I was there. That's where I first learned about you. So It's great to have you here today.
It's great.
And I would love to start by letting our listeners hear it directly from you for those who may not know your full story. Can you take us a little bit back and share a bit about your background and your journey?
Sure. I'll try and make it quick because it's extensive, but I'll make it quick. I was born into a family that was doing quite well financially. My dad was making about $90,000 a year in 1969. We lived in a big, beautiful house overlooking a swanky country club and a view of Lake Washington and Seattle and the Cascade Mountains. And 1970, I was 4 years old. My dad woke up on May 1st, had flu-like symptoms. Long story short, he died of cancer 6 months later. He had no insurance, like $30,000 worth of life insurance. So my mom had to sell that house because she couldn't afford a $400 a month mortgage payment. And in fact, that house recently sold for $3.8 million. And that began a downward spiral, 28 homes, 11 different schools, shipped off to live with relatives twice, once in the 4th grade, once in the 9th grade, started drugs in the 6th grade, all that stuff. And then my life change happened when I was 17 years old. And a good friend of mine, I spent the night with him on a Saturday night, and his mother burst down the door Sunday morning. She said, "Get up, we're going to Sunday school." And I got to tell you, I had no religious background at all, nothing. I literally did not know what the term Sunday school meant. And so she took me off to this little youth group at this little Lutheran church in North Bend, Washington. And I met a youth minister there, and he helped me get my life turned around. He showed me that God had a purpose for my life. And then I became a pastor for 14 years. And I started speaking right out of college because of my crazy upbringing. And then eventually that turned into time management seminars and then leadership seminars. And then I connected with John Maxwell. I ghost wrote for John Maxwell for, probably 2 years. And then I spent 7 years working with Jim Rohn. And I spent 2 years co-hosting Zig Ziglar's television show. So that was a great boost to my career. And now jump forward to 2025. I've written 25 books in 14 languages and given 2,500 speeches all over the world. And it's been a crazy but very fun life.
How did it happen, going from being a pastor to go full time in business and personal development?
I'll tell you what, it was easy. There is no better training for becoming a speaker than being a pastor and preaching 3 times a week. In fact, I have some friends who are keynoters. They give the same speech, every speech. And they'll call me up and they'll go, "Oh, this company hired me, but they want me to customize it for their company." And I'm like, dude, I used to do 150 different speeches a year. There's no better training. And there's a lot of well-known speakers who used to be pastors, very successful. And the best speakers are the ones who started out as youth pastors. Because if you can command a group of 100 8th graders, you can take any group on. If you can speak to 100 8th graders, that's the ultimate test you will ever experience as a public speaker. And so it was actually great preparation for me.
No doubt. And then working with those with giants like Jim Rohn, Zig Ziglar, and John Maxwell, what do you think that made them choose you? Why? How did you get to work with them?
Well, I'll tell you a good business lesson, and it's a good life lesson. I wanted to be a big time speaker. I really wanted to. And I wanted to succeed. I wanted to have my voice heard. And I had opportunities with each of those 3 men. Now, most speakers, when they meet those guys, they say, "I want to be just like you. Can you help me?" Wrong question. Guys at that level don't have a lot of time to help you. So I asked a different question. "I want to be just like you. How can I help you?" Well, John needed ghostwriting services. So I ghost wrote for John for 2 years. I wrote his nationally syndicated column for 2 years. Zig Ziglar had just started getting dementia and his memory was going. So they needed a co-host to kind of move the show forward. I raised my hand. I'll be the co-host. And then Jim Rohn, he wanted a co-writer for the Jim Rohn 1-Year Success Plan and then for the book 12 Pillars. And I said, I can do that. I've actually thought about writing a book called The Power of Being the Second Fiddle. Because if you're in the orchestra, you have first chair, second chair, third chair, it's better to be the second chair violin in the New York orchestra than it is to be the first chair in the, Omaha orchestra. Right? And so you position yourself next to people who are great. And the way to position yourself next to people who are great is to serve them. If you start asking other people, "How can I help you?" you're going to go farther, way farther. And if you ask the right people, "How can I help you? I just want to be involved. How can I help you?" In fact, my dad was making $90,000 a year. He was the chief financial officer of what is now one of the largest architecture firms in the world, NBBJ. And they only had one office at the time with about 150 architects, but now they have offices all over the world with like 7,500 architects, 10,000 architects. And The way my dad got that job was when he was finishing accounting school, he went to NBBJ and said, I'll make you a deal. And this was when they were very small, like maybe 5 architects. And he said, I'll make you a deal. I will do all of your books for free for 2 years while I finish up school. And if I do a good job, you hire me as the chief financial officer. And that's how he got that job. And so he worked for free for 2 years. And they hired him, and he achieved, he wasn't wealthy, but he was making a lot of money. And had he lived, he would have ended up very wealthy.
Oh, that's a great lesson. I mean, it's just make things happen, right?
Yeah.
What you want, make it happen. Go there and make it happen.
Yep.
Oh, perfect. That's a great lesson. Working with those people like Jim Rohn, and I go back to those three, Jim Rohn and Zig Ziglar and John Maxwell, what were the biggest lessons you got from them?
The biggest lesson was to be yourself. And that seems a little weird at first, but let me explain. When you look at, let's just take Zig and Jim. Zig Ziglar and Jim Rohn were at the top of the speaking world. They're legends. They're going to go down as legends. They're both passed away. People still read their books. They still listen to their audio programs. They were legends. And they were about the same age, and they were friends. But you could not find two people who were more different than Zig Ziglar and Jim Rohn. Zig Ziglar would prance the stage back and forth. He'd shout, and then he'd get down on one knee at the front of the stage, and he'd whisper to the crowd. And then Jim Rohn stood behind a lectern for 60 minutes. And he'd have his reader glasses on like this, and he'd talk like this. And we always knew Jim was getting excited when he made his power move. And his power move was this, right? And so what I realized was, these guys are both at the top of the speaking world, but they're very different. They're almost complete opposites. Zig could have been a politician. I mean, he would work the crowd and talk to people. And Jim, he came down, he gave a speech, he went back up to his hotel room because he was an introvert. Zig was a massive extrovert. Jim was a massive introvert. And what I realized was, I didn't need to be Zig Ziglar, and I didn't need to be Jim Rohn. I needed to be Chris Widener. And that's the biggest lesson I learned from working with those guys.
Another great lesson for sure, because we always try to be other people that we look up to, and then we are like fakes, right?
Yeah, and you try to talk like them, and you try to speak like them, and
exactly.
And what you really become is just a really bad knockoff.
It's true, so true. Now, you wrote that book with Jim Rohn, the 12 Pillars. I have it right here, by the way.
There you go.
And such a great book. How it was to work closely with him in this project? Any behind the scenes moments that you can share with us?
Well, I'll tell you, my favorite behind the scenes moment with Jim was the first time I ever met him. And we had been writing together for 7 months, but he was in Beverly Hills and I was in Seattle, and we had not met yet. So he was given a seminar at the Houston Astrodome. And so the guy who was the president of the company and I, we flew down to the Houston Astrodome. It was June 19th, 2003. And after he was done, we were staying at a little hotel across from the Astrodome, and it had it was kind of an old Western hotel or something, if I remember right. It had one of those bars that had wooden floors, and you ate the peanuts and you threw the shells on the floors. So the first night I ever met Jim Rohn, we spent 2 hours drinking beer, eating peanuts, and talking about the Bible. And it was just, Jim was a small group guy, not a big group guy. And so just sitting there and having that time with him was funny, because it's the first time I ever met him, and it was probably the highlight, but it was interesting. I tried to find his voice, and, because I wrote the books and used his ideas and things like that. So trying to find his voice. So I tried to spend a lot of time, obviously getting to MC events and speak at events with him. And then I did Jim's last ever video recorded interview. We didn't know that he was sick. And he got sick shortly thereafter. Just a couple months later, he got sick. And basically the last year of his life, he didn't travel or speak or anything like that. So I got him on his last video recording. It's what a great honor to be able to do that.
It is. Wow. Now, Chris, you've been called America's #1 influence and impact strategist. What does influence really means to you?
Well, so influence is really simple, right? And the last 1,000 speeches I've given have been on my book, The Art of Influence. And influence is really simple. It's, are you able to change other people's thoughts, beliefs, and actions when you engage with them? Because if they don't change their thoughts, beliefs, and actions when you engage with them, you aren't a person of influence. In fact, John Maxwell always said, if you think you're a leader and you're taking a walk, or no, if you think you're a leader and there's nobody following you, you're just taking a long walk. And the reality is that most people don't understand how influence works. What is it that really triggers in the other person's mind? I want to follow this person. I want to know more from this person. I want to learn more. I want to do more. I want to work with this person. And influence is something that we use in all areas of our life. You know, if you don't have influence of your children, if you don't have influence with your spouse, if you don't have influence with the people you work with or the people who work for you, it makes it a lot more difficult. So how do we live our lives in such a way that other people listen to us and they change because of us? And, you know, I will say, how many of you are in sales? How would you like to sell, 5 times more stuff? How many of you would like to have influence over your kid when you tell your kid to go clean his room rather than griping and complaining? He says, you know what, Dad, that's a really good idea. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Like, we would all love to be able to influence our spouses, and our children and our coworkers and our neighbors and all those kinds of things. So influence is one of those things that most people don't really think about. They know what it is, but they don't really think about how it works.
That's true. That's true, because everybody, especially now, everybody talk about influence, but what really means, they don't really know.
Yeah.
And it is basically what you are saying. Yeah.
And most people think that influence is about position, and it's really not about position at all. You have parents who have the position of leadership, but they don't have influence with their kids. You have bosses. You might even own the company. But if nobody listens to you and they just kind of roll their eyeballs at you when you talk, you don't have influence. So, it's important for us to understand how important influence really is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, true. Now, you've spoken on stages all over the world, right? Many countries. And what's been one of the most memorable moments from your speaking career?
Well, the first thing I have to ask you is, where is your accent from?
Portugal. I'm original from Portugal.
Oh, Portugal. My wife is half Portuguese.
Really?
Yeah, she's half Spanish and half Portuguese. So,
yeah,
but I've never been to Portugal.
Well, if you come here, let me know.
I will tell you.
I am very often in Portugal. I am now. My daughter is getting married, so if you come here, let me know.
Oh man, I can't tell my wife that you just said that, because we'll be on the next plane out. I've never been to Portugal. Want to go there. I've had a great opportunity to travel a lot of great places. I loved Egypt. I've spoken twice in Egypt. And of course, you got all the culture there, and you have the pyramids and the Sphinx and all those kinds of fun things. I spoke in St. Petersburg, Russia, for a 3-day seminar. That was amazing. The Russian people were amazing, really great people. Oftentimes we look at countries and we look at them as their governments and not the people. And so that was amazing. I gave a speech once. This was a virtual speech, but I gave a speech to 7,000 Iranians in Tehran via virtual. And they had the camera turned around so I could see the audience. And I gave my speech, 45 minutes. And I ended that speech by saying, I just want to say something personally to you before I go. I know that our governments have conflict and, all those kinds of things, but I also know from traveling the world that the average person in these countries wants the same thing as the average person in the other country. I said, I know that you want to love your spouse, you want to raise great children, you want to be financially independent, you want to make a difference in this world while you're in it. And I just want to tell you that the American people love you, and we assume that you love us. And I got a 2-minute standing ovation after saying that. And that was pretty special, even though I wasn't there. I've been to Rome and Florence and China and Shanghai and Beijing and Hong Kong and Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane and Cologne, Germany, and that was a lot of fun. That was one of my bigger speeches. That was about 18,000 people, but all around America. You know, it's just been a great career. I've gotten to meet a lot of people. I've gotten to see lots of great sights. You know, obviously a lot of those cities you can understand the sights that I was able to see, but really just realizing that people are the same all over the world. They're really the same all over the world. They all want the same thing when it boils down to it. They want to find love. They want to be happy. They want peace in their life. They want to be able to provide for themselves and their families and the people they care about. And they want to know that when their life is over, they made a difference. And it doesn't matter if you're Russian or Chinese or American or Iranian or Portuguese, you know, that's what people want out of life. And that's what I've tried to make my life about is seeing people for who they are and not for the assumptions that we make about them.
When you're speaking to different audiences, whether it is to Microsoft, Harvard Business School, or to somebody in Russia, or does your approach changes, or it's always the same? How do you prepare for that?
It changes a little bit. Like sometimes it changes with industries, right? So when you talk to a bank, you talk about customers. When you talk to a credit union, you talk about members. In fact, they get a little offended if you say the word customers because they don't have customers.
Really?
They have members because you're a member of the credit union. And sometimes you have to, things get lost in translations. There's certain words that we use in American that are in English that are offensive elsewhere because they mean something else. And so you have to be aware of those things. And so culturally, you kind of have to prepare. Certainly there's some times when you have to do, you have to use an interpreter. So in fact, in Russia, I did a 3-day seminar in Russia and I had to develop this pattern with my interpreter. And now granted, they hired one of the best interpreters in Russia. And so he was really good. It took us about 45 minutes to get our pace, but for the next 2 3/4 days, man, we were just down him, me, him, me, him, me. So, you know, there's some of that. I do a little bit of research on the companies beforehand. Oftentimes I'll tell the person who hires me, why don't you give me the name of connect me with the CEO, connect me with a VP, connect me with a manager, and connect me with somebody in the mailroom. And I'll get on the phone with them for 10 or 15 minutes. And I'll say, what are the biggest challenges that you're experiencing there at that company? And what's interesting is oftentimes I'll talk to the CEO, the VP, the manager, and the guy in the mailroom, and they might say wildly different things, but they'll all say one thing. And if you have the guy in the mailroom saying the same thing as the CEO and the other two guys in between, now you've hit on something, because that means it's a bigger problem. And so I try to do a little bit of intel. I try to talk to people who are working there and leading there. And then I try to incorporate that into my speech.
Mm-hmm. No. And to be a good speaker, you have to be a good storyteller, right?
Yeah.
And you are a great storyteller. Right. I mean, Jim Rohn was a good storyteller. I'm thinking about Tony Robbins is a good storyteller. What makes a good storyteller, in your opinion?
I think a mastery of the language. You have to be able to have a mastery of the language and a creativity to you. And I think you have to understand what really connects with people. It's funny. I'll go in to talk about sales at a major corporation and they'll say, you're going to tell your story about growing up, right? And I'm like, well, I remember the first time it ever happened to me. I was doing a big speech for Microsoft, and one of the women, the woman who hired me, she had heard me tell my story, and she said, "You're going to tell your story, right?" And I said, "Well, I can, but do you think that that'll really connect with the audience? My crazy upbringing. It has really nothing to do with sales." And she said, "But you know what it does? It helps people realize that you're real, and it helps people say to themselves, if he can do it, I can do it. If he can overcome that, I can overcome what I'm dealing with." And I had never thought about that before. And so it's about finding good stories that connect. It's about finding stories that represent a broad spectrum of emotion. So sometimes you want to tell a sad story, and sometimes you want to tell a really interesting story, and sometimes you want to tell a funny story. And what that does, it allows you to connect with people emotionally at different levels. But it also captures people who are more into the funny stuff and people who are more into the sad stuff and more people who are in, the interesting stuff, and allows you to kind of hit your whole audience. So I think that storytelling, there's the old saying, it says facts tell and stories sell, right? So, you could have a family of, a mom and a dad and two kids walk onto your car lot and they say, we're looking for a minivan. And you could say, oh, yeah, this minivan, it gets 55 miles to the gallon, and it has a 6-cylinder, and it has this amount of torque, and it has 200 square feet or cubic feet of storage in the back, and you're telling them facts. But if you say, oh, this one, you guys, are you into like road trips? Oh, we're totally into road trips. Can you imagine yourself? I mean, I could see you guys driving this to the Grand Canyon, and, the kids are in the back and they've got the TVs. They're able to watch the TVs and, or whatever. And it's got great air conditioning. So you don't have to worry if you're in the hot areas or whatever, but can't you just really see yourself cruising down the road? You're telling a story. You're getting them to use their imagination. And so those are the kinds of things that, whether you're a public speaker or you're selling stuff or you're leading an organization, tell the stories, make people use their imagination of what could be.
Yeah, because just facts, the people get tired of it. Story, yeah, makes totally sense. What's the business lesson that you've learned the hard way? But that you think, okay, it was hard, but I'm glad that I went through.
Every bad thing that has ever happened to me in business was because I chose the wrong partner. Every single one of them. I've had just lazy partners, and I've had mean partners, and I've had crooked partners. And at one point, my son, who's 34 now, he said, Dad, I think your partner picker's broken. I said, my partner picker may be broken. I need to really look at who I make my partners. Number one thing, pick your partners right. Pick good people. I would rather have a good person who on a talent scale of 1 to 10 is an 8 than a bad person who's a 10.
No, it's true, because a partner is everything. I mean, it's the person you are there every day working with, and you have to trust. So, yeah.
Zig Ziglar used to say, never do a good deal with a bad guy. Never do a good deal with a bad guy. And I've done that 2 or 3 times in my life, and those are the 2 or 3 worst experiences I've ever had in my life.
And you learned from it.
And I learned from it. I'm very, very specific now about who I bring into partnerships.
And Chris, about success, what does that mean for you? And has that definition changed over the years?
No, I've always had the same definition. If I said to you, oh, I know this really successful guy. I mean, this guy's really successful. I mean, we're talking about successful. If I said to you, what are you imagining in your mind? Most people are going to say, well, he probably drives a fancy car. He wears nice suits. He lives in a big house, has a great vacation home, eats at great restaurants. Everything we use for a default definition of success is monetary. And monetary success is great. But at the end of the line, if I said to you, would you like to make $10 million and lose your wife and kids? Nobody would want that. If I said you could make $10 million, but you're going to die at 35 in a tragic accident or a disease, nobody would choose that. So what I try to do is I try to get people to open the scope of what they believe success is. So what I've always said for 20 something years now is true success is not the overachievement in one area, but the balanced achievement in all areas. Yeah, you want to make that money that allows you to live the life you want to live, but you also want a great marriage, and you want your children to love you, and you want them to become productive members of society, and you want to be relatively healthy and live a long life, and you want to have good friends who will tell you the truth and enjoy life with you. And so often everybody views success as just monetary, and they give up everything else and they lose the things that are really important.
It's so true. And I'm thinking, you coach many high achievers, and I'm thinking for them, there must be like a common blind spot, misunderstanding about that, about success, right?
Oh, number one thing, I have people in my coaching program. If anybody's interested in looking at it, they can go to chriswidenercoaching.com. And I do a free 30-minute consultation with people. If they want to go there and schedule that, that's great. Almost everybody hires me for business advice. And the number one problem they really have is their marriage. By far and away. I work with a lot of very highly successful men and women, and they're great at work, but they have sacrificed their marriage to be great at work. And they bring home all this money, and at best, it's a Band-Aid to their marriage problems. And at worst, they end up splitting up and losing half their money. And so I am really all about, or, they're making a ton of money, but they're really fat and overweight and they're going to die early. Or they never go to their kids' ball games and their kids hate them. Or XYZ LMNOP, take your pick. So what I really try to work with is, I try to help them with business and leadership and sales and those kinds of things. But I also try to give them a broader perspective of what success really looks like and what will make them look back on their life at the end of their life and say, I lived a successful life. I made a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, it's about everything together. It's not just about money. And so often we focus about the success of our business, about our bank account, and we forget other things. And that in the end of the day, that's what matters.
If I opened my phone up, I could show you billionaires, senators, rock stars, professional athletes, and I will tell you the only thing that they have that you don't is more money. But I mean, I could pick guys out of that phone, and their wives are sick. They've been divorced 3 times. Their children won't talk to them. They're so overweight themselves. They're sick. The only thing rich people have that you don't have is money. Now, money's great. Zig used to say money isn't everything, but it's right up there with oxygen. But it is. You need money. You got to pay your bills. But the reality is all of the rich people I know, fabulously wealthy people, they have the same problems you and I do. Exact same, and sometimes even worse. I have a very, very dear friend of mine, just a wonderful human being, and makes more money than you and I will ever make in our lifetimes combined. And his wife is very sick. And it's very sick and ongoingly sick, not terminally sick, but just sick, and has some real physical ailments that will be with her for a long time. And it has really put a hindrance on, he's the kind of guy that they should be traveling the world. They should be enjoying all these fantastic things. And she can't do most of it. And so all of that money does him no good. There's no good. Does nothing. I mean, it allows him to drive really nice cars, but it doesn't make him any happier. He doesn't find his happiness in his money. And that's one of the great things about him. He's really just a terrific guy, and he really knows what life is all about. But, people would look at him. He'll pull up in his Lamborghini Urus or one of his 15 Porsches he owns, or the Rolls Royce, or, all those kinds of things. And they'll go, look at that guy. Boy, wouldn't I like to be him. You wouldn't. If you had to take everything, you wouldn't.
Chris, what helps you push through difficult seasons? If you have setbacks, I'm sure you had a few.
Oh, man.
What motivates you to bounce back?
I look at the totality of my life and what I want it to be. And I also understand that setbacks and failures are part of life. If your expectation is, I'm never going to fail and I'm never going to have a setback, you're going to be greatly disappointed your entire life. But if you say these things are part of life and they're part of business, then when you come to them, you don't get disappointed. You get empowered. You say, I'm going to learn a lot from this. I got to figure out a way to make this work. I got to figure out a way to push through this. I have this little bit in my speech where I say, people will say to you, you say to them, how are you doing? And they say, pretty good under the circumstances. Well, nobody wants to be with you if you're under the circumstances. Victorious people are never under the circumstances. They figure out a way to go through the circumstances, around the circumstances, over the circumstances. You never want to find yourself under the circumstances. And I think your perspective, if you know that life is hard, Jesus said, in this world, you'll have trouble. There has never been a more true statement made on the face of the earth than in this world, you'll have trouble. But then he said, but fear not, I've overcome the world. And that's the overcomer's creed, right? Is don't worry, I know how it ends. If I push through this, I can make something good come out of this, no matter how bad it is. Another thing is the Bible says, give thanks in all things. It doesn't say give thanks for all things, because there's some terrible things that happen in this world. You don't have to give thanks for those terrible things, but you can give thanks while in those terrible things. You can find something to be thankful for when something bad happens. Yeah, you don't like that bad thing, and yeah, you wish that bad thing didn't happen, but I can still be a thankful, grateful person even though it happened. And I think that that's just great advice. Give thanks in all things. Don't give thanks for all things.
Oh, that's a great advice indeed. Now, Chris, you have produced CDs, DVDs, personal development and business development. You have written over 25 books. It's a lot of content, right? How do you stay creatively inspired and focused? How does that happen?
I read a lot, and I read very deep things, and I read very light things, and everything in between. I am never afraid to show up at a cocktail party because I know at least a little bit about everything, enough to carry on a short conversation, right? I used to be really into sports when I was growing up. I don't know much about sports now. I don't follow sports, but if somebody says, "Hey, did you watch the NBA the other day?" I can tell you who the best players are. I can have a little bit of a conversation. I can talk about spirituality. I can talk about business. I can talk about politics. You may not like my politics, but I can talk about politics. And I think that it's really important when we learn a lot about the world. It makes it, they use the term worldly. He's a very worldly guy. And there's some ways that I don't like the term worldly, but knowing at least a little bit about a lot of things, it will stir your creativity. In the last 2 years, I took up a new hobby. I needed a new hobby. I had gotten way too involved in politics, and I'm like, I'm done with politics. I'm tired of the fighting. I need to get into something else. And so I've always liked to cook. So in the last 2 years, I've become a really, really good cook. In fact, Friday night, my wife and I are going and taking a cooking class on Friday night. And so I've learned a lot about food. I've learned a lot about wine. And, it used to be that I just cooked steak and potatoes, right? Or chicken and asparagus. I was like very not creative. But I've watched every episode of Beat Bobby Flay that he's ever done in the last 2 years. And I've just learned a ton of things about creativity of seasoning your food and sauces that go with your food and, the combinations of food and the combinations of cereal. And that's all creativity. In fact, we're talking about cooking, but there's some great life lessons here. Beat Bobby Flay is a show where two chefs come on and they have to compete against each other. And then whoever wins, they have to compete against Bobby Flay. And what's fascinating is Bobby Flay will have these people who will come on and they'll go up against him and they'll be from some other country. And he always lets them choose the meal that they have to compete against. And he'll say, well, you're Vietnamese. I'm assuming we're cooking Vietnamese food. We're cooking, and they'll name some random thing I've never even heard of. And it was my grandmother's recipe, and I've cooked this 1,000 times in my life, and I'm going to beat Bobby Flay. And Bobby Flay knows just enough about all these different things, but he's so creative in his ability to match foods and to mix seasonings. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen chefs from all around the world, Africa, Europe, Asia, walk in with what they think is going to be this recipe that's going to beat Bobby Flay, and his creativity when it comes to the judging. They always say, and the winner of the competition is Bobby Flay, because his creativity, he doesn't have necessarily the high skill set of that particular meal, the knowledge of that meal, but it's all the extra stuff that he brings. And so I think that that's a really good lesson of creativity comes from a lot of knowledge and the ability to go draw outside the circles or paint outside the circles or, whatever. And I think that I love cooking because I've turned it from a science. Like, men are far more likely to do this. Women tend to follow a recipe. Men are more like, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and women are like 1 teaspoon of this. And that's how my wife cooks.
No, it's true.
And men are like, we'll throw some of this in. Oh, it doesn't say it in the recipe, but I bet this would be good. And they put a little bit of that in there. And so that creativity. One of the things I've really learned is, and I had never thought about this, baking is a science. Because if you put in too much baking powder or baking soda or too much sugar or too much flour, it's going to ruin the cake or the pie or the whatever. Cooking is more of an art. Baking, you don't want to go off recipe. Cooking, you can go off recipe.
You can be creative.
Yeah. And so you can probably tell I really enjoy it, and I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about cooking, and I love to eat, obviously. Look at me. But, I've not gotten into baking, but I love cooking and I enjoy it. The other thing I really enjoy about cooking is, I was telling somebody else this earlier today. I was talking to a friend on the phone. I said, the thing that I really like about cooking is, in my business, I rarely get done at the end of the day and say, I accomplished this. Because a lot of work that you do in the personal development is over the course of months or years. But I know that every night at 5:00, when I pull all the stuff out of the thing, I know that by 6:30, I will have finished something.
You see the result.
I see the results, and I love that about cooking. Give me an hour and a half and I can do something. I can finish something in an hour and a half and enjoy it.
What's your favorite dish?
My favorite dish is probably chicken parmesan. I love chicken parmesan. I make a great, in fact, I'll tell you a funny story. My wife and I, our first dinner date was at Bobby Flay's Mesa Grill at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. Spectacular, great meal. Although they had a wobbly table and I bumped it and it spilled water on my wife. I'm surprised she stayed with me. But that restaurant is no longer there. The space is still there. Bobby Flay shut down Mesa Grill and he opened another brand of his called Amalfi. And it's sort of Mediterranean Italian. And so I went to Amalfi with my wife. We went there about a year ago. And we went to Amalfi. We walked in. It's our second date ever, dinner date at a Bobby Flay restaurant in that exact space at Caesar's Palace. And I thought, I'm going to order the chicken parmesan. And I ordered the chicken parmesan. And I said, I don't know whether to be discouraged or encouraged. And she said, why? And I said, well, I don't know if I should be discouraged that this is so bad, or if I should be encouraged that I make a better chicken parmesan than Bobby Flay does. So
you must be proud of yourself.
Yeah. But, I never make it well the first time. It takes me 2 or 3 times and you figure out, I make a really great stuffed pork chop. By the way, folks, I'll give you a free recipe here. It's like 4 things and people will think you're a 5-star chef. Go get yourself a 2-inch pork chop with a bone on it. Cut a pocket into it. Sear it in olive oil on both sides, pull it off, let it rest so it's cool enough for you to be able to handle it. Stuff it with blue cheese and crushed walnuts and season it, right? You season it before you sear it, garlic and salt and pepper and some paprika, very simple. Stuff it with blue cheese and crushed walnuts, bake it at 350 for 30 minutes, pull it out, put brown sugar on top of it, stick it back under the broiler for a minute, pull it out. People will think you're a world-class chef. It is so good, and it is seriously the most simple thing you could possibly do. Guys, if you want to wow your wife, make that recipe, and your wife will be, where did you learn to cook this well? But it's nearly brainless. It's like 4 ingredients, stick it in the oven for 30 minutes. It's really.
Okay, now I want that listeners tell us if they tried it and how it was, because the recipe from Chris.
It's so simple.
Now, you already told me that you cook a lot and that you read a lot.
Yeah.
What's a personal habit or daily practice that you have that makes a major impact on your success?
My wife and I like to walk. We like to walk, and it gives us a chance to talk every day. That's great. My wife and I start out every day. Our alarm goes off at 6 a.m. We get up and we make coffee and tea, and we sit down and we read one chapter of the Bible together. And then we read one chapter of a book together. And sometimes we read a book on money. Sometimes we read a book on relationships. Sometimes we read a book on, whatever, and on marriage, whatever. And then we say a short prayer for each other for that day. Takes us no longer than 20 minutes. And that is probably the best thing that I do every day. Before we start our day, we sit down together, we read together, we pray together, we talk together, and then we go about our day. And she works from home and I work from home as well. So,
and by the way, I also heard, I believe it was in your Instagram. It was just your anniversary.
Well, it was the anniversary of our first date.
Oh, of your first date.
We celebrate the anniversary of our first date and our engagement and our wedding. So May 4th was our first date, and we met online. I swiped right.
Really?
In fact, we have an audio program called Swipe Right for Mr. and Mrs. Right, online dating for the 40 plus crowd. That's the name of our audio program. You can find it on Audible, and it's Denise and I doing the audio program together. And I walked in, I saw her. We had a great lunch. 3 weeks later, we had another great lunch. And 3 days after that, I moved from Scottsdale back to Seattle. And we're like, okay, how's this going to work? Well, we spent about 100 hours on the phone and doing video calls and stuff. And we said, why don't we go meet in Las Vegas? Let's just eat at some great restaurants and go to some great shows. And at the end of that weekend, I was ready to marry her. And
when you know, right?
When you know, you know. I'm like, I have met my soulmate. And we work very hard at our marriage. We listen to each other, and we try to serve one another. We try to speak kindly to one another, and so we have a great relationship. We wrote a book together called Better the Second Time, and we wrote about it because we've both been divorced, and we didn't want to be divorced again. So we started thinking, what do I need to do in this marriage so that we don't have another divorce? And one of the things that I realized was, if my first wife didn't like it, my second wife probably won't like it either. So I had to look in the mirror and say, what was it? What are the things that I need to change about myself so that I bring a better guy into this marriage? And a lot of self-reflection on that.
What story that I love about when you tell, I heard you tell this story a few times. It's a story, it's about in your book, The Angel Inside. You shared that story about Michelangelo freeing an angel from a block of marble.
Yeah.
Tell your listeners that story and the lesson behind it.
Well, there's a book called The Angel Inside that I wrote, and it's based on a story. It's an old story. I'm sure it's probably not true. But supposedly, when Michelangelo was working on the David, a little boy walked up to him and said, "What are you doing to that rock? Why are you hitting that rock?" And he said, "There's an angel inside, and I'm setting it free." And what's really interesting is about that block of marble is that marble had been sitting in a workshop in Florence, Italy, since before Michelangelo was born. And there were 2 or 3 other artists that the city of Florence had said, we'd like to commission you to create this statue. But it was a little bit too thin. And these artists were afraid that when they hit it with a chisel, it would just break apart. And so nobody had ever even put a chisel to that marble. They had looked at it, they'd come up with ideas, and they just couldn't get themselves to do anything with it. So Michelangelo, really interesting story, the real Michelangelo, in the early 1500s was really the birth of citizen legislatures. So politicians were very, very highly esteemed, and artists were not, which is interesting because in early 1500s, Florence, Italy, you had Michelangelo, you had Leonardo da Vinci, and you had Raphael, all living in a small town of 50,000 people. Three of the greatest artists of all time lived in a small 50,000 person city in Florence, Italy. And of course, it became huge in the Renaissance, and all that. Michelangelo's dad did not want him to be an artist. Do not be an artist, go be a politician. And if you think about that, Michelangelo, if he'd have become a politician, nobody would have ever heard of him. But he followed his own passion and became arguably the greatest artist of all time, certainly the greatest sculptor of all time. And in the book, it's a story about this young American who meets with an older Italian man, and he takes him around the city of Florence and teaches him life lessons from the life of Michelangelo. And they end up at the foot of the David. And I tell the story in there of the real life King David. Now, the real life King David was about 14 years old, and the prophet of Israel was told to go anoint the new king of Israel. And he was told that it was one of Jesse's sons. So he goes to Jesse's house. He said, Jesse, the Lord has told me that one of your sons is going to be the next king of Israel. Will you bring your sons forward? Jesse said, sure thing. This is the best thing that's ever happened to Jesse. The prophet of Israel was there to tell him one of his sons was going to be the next king. He brings his sons out, and one by one, the prophet says, it's not him, and it's not him, and it's not him, and it's not him. And he goes back to Jesse, and he goes, are these all your sons? He goes, well, I got this little 14-year-old kid. He's out tending the sheep. And he said, bring him here. And they go out to the fields, and they find this kid. They bring him forward, and Samuel says, that's the guy. And he anoints him as the next king of Israel. And he looks at Jesse and he says, remember, man looks on the outside, God looks on the inside. And that is a powerful lesson for us. Michelangelo's dad said, here's what you should be so that everybody can look at you, but on the inside was an artist. Here's what happened to that marble. Everybody looked at that marble and said, oh man, you put a chisel into that, it's going to fall apart. Michelangelo looked inside and said, the greatest statue ever made is inside this marble. And the same thing is true about us. Some people say, you're too old, you're too young, you're too fat, you're too skinny, you're too tall, you're too short, you're too white, you're too black, you're too Asian, you're too this, you're too that, none of the outside matters. What's up here and what's in here, that's what matters. And that's the lesson of the angel inside, is how to find that powerful person inside of you. And it's really not about doing what everybody else wants you to do. It's about doing what God wants you to do. And it's about doing what you were created for. And it's about what your passion is and what your giftedness is and what your talent is. And I love that book. It's my favorite book that I've ever written, The Angel.
It's a great story. There's a great lesson in there. Now, Chris, tell our listeners about your new book, The Coming American Revival, and what inspired it. Yeah. And why now?
Well, it's a little bit of my throwback to my pastor's days, but it's about the spiritual state of America. America is the most prosperous nation. We're the wealthiest nation. We're the most powerful nation. But there's some real problems in our country. And I've been telling people for the last 6 months, our problem isn't a political problem. Our problem is a spiritual problem. We are greatly polarized. Half the country hates the other half of the country. And we've lost our way. Spiritually, we've lost our way. And I believe that there needs to be a revival of faith. There needs to be people reconnecting with what the real purpose of life is all about. And so I wrote in the notes, it's not a prophecy, it's not a prediction, it's not a promise, but it's a declaration of faith. I really believe that we're at a state where people are looking around and they're saying, we've got some problems here. And the problem starts with me. So I'm just challenging people to reconnect with their faith, to reconnect with their purpose, to reconnect with God, and to live the life that they were designed and created to live.
Many of our listeners are entrepreneurs, executives, leaders, investors. How do you see that message of revival applying to the world of business and leadership?
Well, in that book, I have sections. How would a revival affect business? How would it affect politics? How would it affect your marriage? Right? So when you reconnect with God and you have this relationship with God and your faith is revived and now you have a stronger belief, well, what would happen in the business world if people stopped taking advantage of each other? That's what revival would bring. It would bring a conscience to people. I can't take advantage of people anymore. I have to be honest. I have to have integrity. How would revival fix your marriage if all of a sudden, instead of viewing your spouse as your opponent, you experience them as your partner, your God-given partner? How would revival change the politics if our politician said, I can't lie to people anymore? I got to tell the truth. I really believe that revival, a faith revival, would transform any country. And when you look at the difference between North Korea and South Korea, where one is a capitalistic, free market, faith-driven, South Korea is one of the most Christianized nations in America. You go 50 feet across the DMZ into North Korea, where it's atheistic, communistic, and all those things, and people are starving to death. And I just look at the difference between North Korea and South Korea, and you can see the real role that faith plays in a society.
Is it on sale everywhere, or
yeah?
Just
in fact, if you go to comingamericanrevival.com, it'll take you right to the Amazon
you
page.
can order there.
comingamericanrevival.com.
Okay. We'll put it in the description, folks.
Cool.
Now, and when you are writing a book, what's your process? How do you manage your time? You stay focused? You block your time? No distractions? How you do it?
There's two different kinds of writers. There are disciplined writers and there are inspirational writers. There's a guy named Chuck Swindoll who's probably sold 50 million books. He's written 35 books and maybe 70 books. I don't even know. And he always says, I write one page a day. Sunday through Saturday, I sit down and I handwrite one page a day. I put it down. And at the end of the year, I've written 365 pages. That's a disciplined writer. I am more of an inspirational writer. I will study and research and listen and watch and I'll take notes and I just set them aside. And then all of a sudden I kind of just feel it whoosh out. The Angel Inside, I researched for 9 months and I wrote it in 5 days. I cleared my calendar for 5 days from 9 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. And I went to a Starbucks outside of Seattle, Washington from 9 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon, 5 days. It's a 20,000 word book. And I wrote 4,000 words a day. And at 5 o'clock, I walked out the door. 9 a.m. the next day, I walked in the door. I wrote the whole thing in 5 days. So I'm much more of an inspired writer, where I do all the stuff and I think about it and I process it and I take notes and then it just comes right out on the paper.
And you are there in the Starbucks writing and no problem with distractions, you focus?
Well, I'm ADD and ADHD, which means that I actually work better in that atmosphere. You put me in a quiet room, I can't do it. You put me in a room where there's all this stuff going on and I push it out, but it keeps my brain energized. My subconscious is energized by all the stuff going on around me. So that's more just of a personal thing. The other thing, and for those of you thinking about writing a book, I do book coaching and I tell people it's like a body. You start with the bones, and the bones are the chapters and the lessons and the outline. Then you layer in the tendons, which are the stories. And then you layer in the muscles, which is the quotes and then you end up with putting the skin on it and wrapping it up and polishing it up. So Always start with the outline, always start with the structure, and then layer the other things over the top. And then at the end, your editor can help you get that thing polished up and ready to go.
Chris, are there plans or projects that you're especially excited now for the future?
Yeah, I'm actually planning for the 250th anniversary of America. Next year is our 250th anniversary of the writing of the Declaration of Independence. We, myself and two partners, we're planning on putting on the largest revival meeting in American history. We're going to have 15,000 people live in Jacksonville, Florida, and then we're going to live stream it to over 10 million people via pray.com, which is the world's largest prayer app. They have 24 million people. They're going to live stream it. We're going to live stream it to homes, to churches, to colleges, to prisons, to military bases. And we're hoping to have over 10 million people online with us that day.
Wow.
So, and it's going to be, okay, we've been around for 250 years. Let's recognize our past and our history of being a country that was built on Christian faith and Christian principle.
Oh, that's a great project.
Yeah, we're excited about it.
Now, Chris, before we finish, one last question. If you could leave our listeners an advice, what would be the piece of advice that you would leave them, that you took from your journey so far?
The best piece of advice I was ever given, I was 22 years old, and somebody said, be a voice, not an echo. I have thought about that for 37 years now, I guess it's been. I'm 59 years old now. 37 years I've thought of that. Be a voice, not an echo. Don't just regurgitate what you hear from other people. Don't just quote other people. Don't just let other people do the thinking. You need to go deep. You need to learn the knowledge. You need to create the wisdom. You need to be able to bring it from yourself and to be a voice, not an echo. Be the one that's different, not the one that looks and sounds like everybody else. That's the best piece of advice I ever got. Be a voice, not an echo.
It's a great advice. Goes back a little bit to what you said before about be yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Chris, thank you so much for sharing your journey, your insights, your wisdom with us today. It's been a pleasure to have you here. From leadership to legacy, storytelling to revival, you've reminded us how influence starts with service and how powerful it is when we live with authenticity and purpose.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Maria. I'll come on anytime you want me. It was fantastic.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Now, to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. I hope today's episode gave you something to reflect on, to be inspired by, and maybe even to act on. I'm Maria Mollen, and this is the Now You Know podcast. See you next time.